It's your good friend and neighbour, Old Fowley. Hello. Good news and bad news. First, the title of this video is total clickbait. Alas, you have been duped.
You suck!
But you are 30 seconds into the video and that counts as a view on YouTube, so good for me. Yay! But hang about, there's good news because you're about to see some records which I would hazard a guess have never been shown before in the VC. But the bad news is they aren't records, they're CDs. But the good news is it isn't classical music. The bad news is that, for want of a better word, it's what we'll call post-war contemporary classical music. In short, we're going to look at some music by influential musical thinkers which may or may not have significant enough echoes in their work to resonate with well-rounded members of the rock music community. Now, I know you're all going, what the fuck?
What the fuck?
But I'm hoping that the laser drops you're about to hear will more adequately explain things than any incessant waffle on my part. Now, when I say post-war, you will ask, what war do you mean?
What war do you mean?
Well, of course, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. You must remember that. It was in all the papers. Because it was just after this war that young Erik Satie was enrolled in the Conservatoire in Paris to study big, serious music, to learn how to become a big, serious composer. Now, Satie's the kind of guy whose music you know, but you don't necessarily know that you know it, and you don't necessarily know the name of it, especially this piece. Now, old Satie didn't do too well at the Conservatoire because music at the time was dominated by composers like Wagner or Mahler, who wrote big, serious music with big, serious themes and ridiculously complex harmonic ideas. And Satie, as you heard from his nude dancing music, favoured a more considered and minimalist approach. This got him chucked out of the Conservatoire not once, but twice. Old Erik was a bit like Miles Davis, I guess, at Juilliard, who couldn't concentrate on learning his scales while all that hot jazz was playing down on 52nd Street. Or he was like the punk rockers who wanted simpler, more concise music in the face of farty old dinosaur bands like Pink Floyd. All the while composing his atmospheric, minimalist music. Satie was a real character in real life too. He styled himself as the Velvet Gentleman, having 7 identical beige suits made up for himself. He grew his hair long, he wore a bowler hat, he became a communist, he was a hopeless alcoholic, all of the things that hipsters did in the early part of the 20th century. He kept long lists of his musical enemies, whom he derided constantly in the musical press or from the stage. He did, however, make influential friends with composers like Debussy and Ravel, who championed his music, and suddenly, in 1911, he found himself famous. Of course, he used his fame to wreak further anarchy, writing music with increasingly ridiculous titles. There was True, Real and Preludes for a Flabby Dog, Musical Exasperations of a Big Wooden Man, or Old Sequins and Breastplates. He would write mystifying instructions for his musicians in his scores. Wonder about yourself. Arm yourself with clairvoyance. Eat your breakfast in 4 minutes, consisting only of white foods. Satie finally drank himself to death in 1925 at the very pinnacle of his fame. Rock fans can feel his influence in work, particularly if you're a fan of Brian Eno, who was a huge admirer of Satie's. Music for Airports is a particularly good example. But why do I like it? What Satie back then called furniture music, we might today call ambient music. It's good night music to write YouTube scripts to. It's good Sunday morning, rainy day weather music. It occupies space. It doesn't retreat, but it doesn't intrude. You have to lean into it. And it has a tune, which is more than you can say for a lot of rock music. He does, however, use repetition and slight variation to draw you in. I'd recommend it if you want to put aside music that throws everything it has at you and instead asks you to use what you know about music to unpick it. Well, Satie was a hard act to follow, but follow him we must, and we will with a man who is the most performed neoclassical composer in the world today, and he has been for a few years. And to make him even more exotic and mysterious, he comes from Estonia. His name, if you haven't guessed already, is Arvo Pärt.
Who the hell is Arvo Pärt?
Who the hell is Arvo Pärt, I hear you ask? Well, the odds are you've probably heard some of Arvo's music, but you don't actually know it. In fact, there's some right now.
Yeah, everyone else is on the carrier.
You know, this works.
We maybe don't walk away.
Maybe not.
Yes, in behind all that whiz-bangery and earnest overacting is Arvo's classic hit Berliner Messe No. 1, Kyrie. He has over 150 soundtrack credits on IMDb and over 100 original score credits. Don't ask me the difference. Interesting thing about Pärt is that as a kid, the piano that he learned on was broken. The middle register of the piano didn't work, so he learned to play using only the bottom 18 keys and the top 18 keys on the piano. And you can hear that in his composition, particularly his later work with his stark use of register reliefs. So, what's so great about Arvo? Well, his tintinnabuli style, which he developed in the early 1970s, strips music right down to its barest emotional bones. Think bell-like tones, relentless repetition, and a haunting minimalism that builds tension but never drifts off into a sleepwalk. It's like the hypnotic drone you might hear in a shoegaze record, but it's purely acoustic with voices and strings. Pieces like Spiegel in Spiegel or Frates hit that sort of same sweet spot of being immersed that you get from any music that you demand you listen to it and immerse in rather than just letting it wash all over you. It, and a lot of the music that we'll talk about in this particularly difficult video, is all about trying to appreciate texture and space in music, skills that sharpen how you'll listen to your favourites later on. Rock music, especially the over-compressed shit that they shovel onto CDs, doesn't use space well. Pärt's work trains your ear for subtlety and restraint, and bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor or Sigur Rós channel this influence into their epic, wordless builds. Pärt's music can play a fun little game with you too, where you invent little melodies or counterpoints that fill the gaps that he leaves. Or not. From chilly Estonia, we jet next to the horrors of Japan in 1944, where a young man called Toru Takemitsu is snatched out of school and chucked into the Japanese army. That'd bloody rot your socks. And this had a profound effect on his development as a musician, because it led to a long dislike of traditional Japanese music, instead preferring French or American music. Another fact that had a profound effect on him as a musician was a total lack of any formal musical training. In 1948, working for the US occupation forces, he became interested in electronic music, and by 1952 he was composing concertos for piano and compiling music concretes. His big break came in 1957 with his Requiem for String Orchestra, which caught the attention of the famous composer Igor Stravinsky. He later befriended Aaron Copland and John Cage, who reignited his interest in Japanese music. What I dig about Takemitsu is that he fashions music that feels like a delicate watercolour painting, subtle, atmospheric, and deeply attuned to silence and spaces between notes. There are sparse textures, interesting percussion, and slow harmonic shifts, and natural sounds like wind and water that evoke a sort of impermanence. Works like November Steps fuse Japanese instruments like koto with an orchestra to create dreamlike layers that drift rather than drive, while pieces such as A Flock Descends into a Pentagonal Garden shimmer with a gamelan-like resonance and aleatoric freedom. Aleatoric is a big fancy wanker word that musicians like to use, which means arrived at by chance. He probably got that from John Cage, who used to use devices like rolling dice or the I Ching to determine musical pieces on stage, and made fat stacks from it accordingly. Basically, it simply means there are certain parts in the work that the performer has to play intuitively. arming themselves perhaps with clairvoyance. For me, Takemitsu's appeal lies in effortless calm and mystery. It all sounds like a film score, and Takemitsu did work with Kurosawa on Ran. You might drift off from it at first, but its subtle beauty is going to pull you in. Perfect for unpacking a crowded head. Oh, Gyorgy Ligeti was sort of the mad scientist of avant-garde anti-music from the 1950s to the 1980s. He was born in Romania, started working in Hungary, but he got sick of being a communist and he fled to Austria, where they made him a citizen and ultimately a national hero. He's most famous for his music being used in many, many movies. Heat, Godzilla, Shutter Island, the background music for the radio version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and most famously Stanley Kubrick's 2001. Kubrick used some electronic treatments on Ligeti's music in that movie, and that annoyed Ligeti so much that he sued Kubrick, and he won. Kubrick was so horrified by having upset Ligeti that he compensated him very, very well for it. And the two men actually became really good friends. Kubrick used Ligeti's music again in The Shining and in Eyes Wide Shut. So good friends did they become that at the premiere of Eyes Wide Shut, which was after Kubrick had passed away, Ligeti actually escorted Kubrick's widow to the premiere. But what about the music, I hear you ask?
But what about the music?
Full disclosure, at one time in the far distant past, I once described Ligeti's music as sounding like a tea chest full of saucepan lids and kittens being kicked down a spiral staircase. I think I can refine that review somewhat based on further investigation. Ligeti's music sort of has two phases. The first phase, which is very avant-garde. If you're into the stuff that King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard do with all that microtonal razzmatazz, then it may be worthwhile for you to check out pieces like Apparitions or Atmospheres, using a device he calls micropolyphony. I find these pieces quite challenging to listen to because Ligeti plays what we'll call the long game harmonically, and things move very slowly in the piece and sort of get to where it's going before you realise that it's gotten there, if you know what I mean. It's a sonic hallucination. It plays tricks on your ears and with the way your brain expects us to resolve musical sounds. Later in his career, he entered his saucepan and kittens phase. If you're into bands like Mars Volta or maybe even Rush, or you're one of those increasing number of people who think that Sorcerer, Nefertiti, Miles in the Sky was Miles Davis's greatest period, then this is the music perhaps for you. Or if you just feel that music doesn't have to get you from A to B, but it can get you from A to F with a little trip via L, and that sounds like fun, then a CD of Ligeti is 74 minutes well spent. Lastly, from Ligeti's adopted homeland of Hungary, we go next door to Hungary's best friend, Poland, to visit Henryk Górecki, the man they consider to be the most commercially successful recent classical composer. Gorecki began as an avant-garde composer, but he began to get in a lot of trouble with the Stalinist regime, but things freed up a little bit for him after the old bastard died. However, because he mainly worked as a teacher, he was constantly getting hassled by the authorities because all senior professors were supposed to be members of the Communist Party. And he said, nuts to that. The more I hear about this guy, the more I like him. And he wrote music to celebrate and encourage the solidarity strikers in the late 1970s and the 1980s. As I said, his early stuff is based on what we'll call 12-tone theory, which is sort of the opposite of modal music like Miles Davis used on Kind of Blue. And I would try to explain it to you, but I can't because it just does my head in. It throws everything that I know about music out the window and replaces it with a bunch of gobbledygook. Anywho, back to Gorecki. He laboured in obscurity outside Poland until the late 1970s when he wrote his Third Symphony, a symphony of sorrowful song. The Third Symphony's overriding theme is one of motherhood against the backdrop of the various German occupations of Poland. The first movement, based on a 15th century folk song, is one about Mary, Jesus' mum, who is lamenting the death of her son, and it's quite harrowing. It, like all three movements, features a soprano, in this case the American Dawn Upshaw, who is superb, but the Polish Zofia Kalinowicz, whom Gorecki favoured, has since made it her own. But the second movement, considerably shorter than the other two, is overwhelming on every level. Based on a message scratched on the wall in a Gestapo cell in Zakopane, Poland. And I'm going to have to read from the script here. "Oh, mother, do not cry. I cannot remove sadness from my heart. Mother, leave this place, for I feel I am dying." The girl who wrote it, whose name was Helena, was awaiting execution. She used a piece of her own tooth to scratch it in the wall. The music, which is accompanied by a spectral Ave Maria, is uncannily disturbing. I mean, lots of things do that to me. The last two paragraphs of Watership Down can never fail to reduce me to tears, but there's no piece of music that I know that can unfailingly pierce me like the second movement of Gorecki's Third Symphony. The third movement is based on a Silesian folk song. Silesia is the area of Poland that Gorecki came from, about a mother's search for a son after the Silesian uprisings, which occurred after World War I, when Germany still occupied that area. And the locals rebelled because they wanted to join the new nation of Poland. She doesn't know if he's dead or alive, but spoiler alert, it is the Symphony of Sorrowful Song. The symphony lay largely unknown for 15 or so years until the London Sinfonetta recorded it in 1992, and it sold over 1 million copies. Huge numbers for a classical recording, although the Three Tenors was just a couple of years before, and that would have been a mega seller. My advice is to listen to this under headphones and with a big box of tissues handy. And there we have it. I'm not sure if I will spark even a jot of curiosity here, let alone inspire any new listening passions amongst you. But if we're serious about what we're going to do as a vinyl community, then we have to address all of our music and how we relate to it. Sometimes that's just out of commonality. Sometimes it's a lonesome road. Some videos, I guess, are just harder to make than others. Nevertheless, we'll be back in no time with more monkey shines and malarkey, and until that happy day, may all your picks be spectacular and your skips be